Welcome to Syria. A good GDP growth rate, an okay population growth rate, and a growing human development index comparable to its neighbors. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Modern Syria as we know it today only came into existence after the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, which gave France total control over the territory. Following its independence in 1946, Syria faced significant political instability with coups and significant power struggles dominating its early years. And in 1958, Syria briefly merged with Egypt to form the United Arab Republic under the leadership of Egyptian President Nasser, driven by Pan-Arabism. However, the union collapsed in 1961 due to tensions over Egyptian dominance, and Syria reverted to being an independent state. After a few more coups, the corrective movement, also known as the 1970 coup, was a bloodless takeover led by General Hafez al-Assad in Syria. Assad aimed to strengthen the National Socialist line of the state and the Ba'ath party, revising its doctrine to focus on defeating Israel and building Syria's military with Soviet support. Hafez al-Assad had 5 children in total, with his oldest son, Bashar al-Assad, expected to succeed him. Bashar al-Assad was what some people would call a badass. He trained in a special forces unit and later the armored corps after Soviet military training. He was trained as a civil engineer, and most importantly, he was well liked by the ladies. It is as if he was naturally born to lead the country after his father. Well, in January 1994, Bashar would die in a car crash for not wearing his seatbelt. His more well-known brother, Bashar, was the one next in line of succession. Bashar al-Assad had few political aspirations. He worked as an eye surgeon in London and was described as a geeky and quiet guy. His bosses and colleagues even recalled him to be humble and whom nurses thought exemplary in reassuring anxious patients about to undergo anesthetic surgery. However, after learning that his older brother had died, Bashar immediately left London and traveled back to Syria where his father would prepare him to take power. Following his father's death in 2000, Bashar al-Assad became the president of Syria. Now, it's important to point out that the Assads were Alawites, which were a minority group that made up about 10 to 13% of the total population, and they followed Shia Islam compared to the 75% that were Sunni Muslims. This was already a point of contention among the groups. Any hopes for reform quickly dissipated as Bashar continued his father's repressive policies. And despite showing good economic signs on paper, Syria faced severe challenges that amplified public discontent. A prolonged drought from 2006 to 2010 devastated agricultural communities, leading to mass rural-urban migration. Unemployment soared and corruption within the regime worsened. Additionally, the influx of over 1 million Iraqi refugees following the 2003 US invasion placed immense strain on already limited resources, particularly in urban areas like Damascus and Aleppo. The problems in the country would continue to brew until they boiled over in 2011, following the Arab Spring that had started in Tunisia and swept across the Arab world. 100,000 Syrians who took to the streets demanded greater political freedoms and an end to corruption. They were instead met with a brutal crackdown by the government. This heavy-handed response broke the wall of fear that had previously silenced dissent, transforming localized protests into a nationwide revolt. The Assad regime's reliance on Alawite elites in the military and security forces alienated the Sunni majority, while opposition groups often framed their struggle as jihad. By mid-2011, defections began to occur within the Syrian military as officers and soldiers refused to participate in the violent repression of civilians. These defectors formed the Free Syrian Army in July 2011, beginning an armed resistance against the government. By early 2012, the Syrian government lost control over several regions, especially in the northwestern parts of the country. Rebel groups, including the Free Syrian Army, began expanding their influence. In mid-2012, the conflict intensified with battles over urban centers like Aleppo and Damascus. By August 2012, Western nations led by the United States called for Assad to step down, while Russia and China remained steadfast in supporting the Syrian government, vetoing UN security resolutions that would have imposed sanctions on Syria. A year later, a chemical weapons attack occurred in Ghouta, which killed hundreds of civilians. The international community, especially the US, accused Assad's regime of using sarin gas, but Syria denied responsibility, blaming rebel forces. In September 2013, the US threatened military intervention in response to the chemical attack, but a diplomatic solution was reached when Syria agreed to give up its chemical weapons stockpile under a UN-mandated agreement. While this was going on, it's important to note that while the Free Syrian Army aimed to represent a unified opposition, the realities on the ground proved far more complex. Syria's fragmented opposition included Islamist factions like al-Nusra and later extremist groups such as ISIS. Each pursued different goals, complicating efforts to establish a cohesive strategy against the Assad regime. The Free Syrian Army quickly lost its prominence as Islamist factions gained more resources and recruits, often allegedly, accidentally, backed by foreign powers. Whether this was true or not, in January 2014, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria rose to prominence as it expanded its influence over the northern and eastern parts of Syria, declaring a caliphate with Raqqa as its capital. By June 2014, ISIS captured large swaths of land in Syria and Iraq, establishing an Islamic caliphate. People in ISIS began living in some sort of utopic frenzy, with even children signing up to fight. It's really bizarre, and I recommend that you check out Vice's documentary on it below. During all of this mess, the Assad regime managed to frame its uprising as a foreign conspiracy and an Islamic rebellion, portraying itself as a protector of minorities, particularly Alawites and Christians. However, ISIS was advancing rapidly, capturing nearly a third of Syria, and this was truly the peak of their caliphate. Approximately 30,000 fighters from at least 85 countries had joined them, with notable people like Jihadi John, Shamima Begum, and Russell Dennison. Assad desperately needed more support, and in September of 2015, Russia officially entered the conflict, launching airstrikes in support of Assad's government. This intervention finally began shifting the balance of power. Why did they do this? To screw with America. By June 2016, Syrian government forces, bolstered by Russian airstrikes, began regaining key territories, including the historic city of Palmyra. The battle for Aleppo intensified, becoming a focal point in the war. Finally, after months of brutal fighting, the Syrian government forces, with Russian and Iranian support, captured Aleppo in December of 2016, marking a turning point in the conflict in the favor of Assad's regime. Meanwhile, in the northeast, Syrian Democratic Forces, a Kurdish-led group, captured significant territories in northern Syria from ISIS, including the city of Raqqa. By December of 2017, ISIS had lost 95% of its territory, including its two biggest properties, Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, and the northern Syrian city of Raqqa, its nominal capital. The caliphate had truly fallen. The civil war had finally stopped. For 1 month until Turkey launched Operation Olive Branch in January 2018, targeting Kurdish groups in the northern Afrin region of Syria. After 8 months of intense fighting, Turkish forces captured Idlib, marking a significant territorial gain for Turkey and its allied Syrian rebels. Meanwhile, in 2018, US President Donald Trump announced the withdrawal of all American troops from Syria, which would be completed by 2019. Yeah, right. Following a few skirmishes between Russian-backed Syria and Turkish-backed rebels, a ceasefire was brokered by both sides in 2020, establishing a border in northwest Syria which largely ended the fighting. To understand what each side wanted in the conflict, this diagram gives a rough picture of the situation. Russia fought the Kurds, the Free Syrian Army, and other Islamic groups in support of Assad. America supported the Free Syrian Army and the Kurds against Assad. Turkey fought the Kurds while supporting the Free Syrians, choosing their own path. Iran supported Syria while fighting al-Nusra and other Islamic groups, and everyone hated ISIS. The ceasefire in 2020 finally stopped the fighting again, with Syria finally being able to rebuild what it had retaken and most of the Kurdish areas being left alone. Syria kind of turned into a colony state for the foreign actors involved. American troops had still not left all of the country, defending important Kurdish sites and their oil sites. Russian troops mainly focused on the coastal areas, using them to help their logistical operations in Africa and project power in the Mediterranean. Syria also became extremely important for Iran, who used it as a transit hub to fund and supply the Hamas and Hezbollah against Israel. But Turkey was cooking up something different. As one of the initial backers of the Syrian opposition and direct neighbors to Syria, Turkey formed the Syrian National Army to fight the Kurds, and Turkey also began funding the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS for short. The HTS, led by al-Jolani, was formed in 2017 by several Islamic groups merging together, including thousands of former ISIS members joining them. The HTS is currently considered the most powerful military faction within the Syrian opposition, and it is also considered a terrorist group by the United States, the European Union, and Russia. Which is pretty damn funny when you realize that another NATO member is directly funding them. So why did Turkey do this? Nobody truly knows, but you could take a guess. Syria continued to be used as an important transit hub for Iran and their allies, with much of the fighting having ceased and life finally going back to normal. Until all of that went out of the window on the 27th of November 2024, when a coalition of Syrian opposition groups led by the HTS launched a lightning offensive against the Syrian Arab army. In just 3 days, the HTS had managed to capture Aleppo, undoing several years of sweat and blood that Syria had put into capturing and restoring the city. After another 5 days, the key city of Hama was taken, which largely cut off the northeast of the country. The Kurds saw this as an opportunity and restarted their offensive against the Syrian government, recapturing large parts of the northeast. However, the Syrian Arab army was gearing up for a huge fight in Homs, and they had gathered lots of armored formations there. 2 days later, on the 7th, Homs was taken, cutting off the main Russian military ports from the Syrian capital of Damascus. The Syrian government announced that Assad would address the nation, but when the cameras turned on, his army chief spoke instead. On December the 8th, 2024, the capital of Syria, Damascus, had fallen overnight, with Assad nowhere to be seen. The reason the rebels were able to do this quickly was largely through the vast amount of Turkish funding, and Russia being extracted in Ukraine. This should have raised obvious warning signs for Assad's allies, especially Iran, which had much more at stake. However, they chose to take no action beforehand. This was in fact the perfect opportunity for the HTS. The group's current goal is apparently to establish, and I quote, a diversity-friendly jihadist state. The Assad family left behind an unforgettable legacy over Syria. They controlled the country for 53 years, which was so long in fact, that some released political prisoners didn't know about Hafez al-Assad being dead for 24 years and believed that Saddam Hussein's army had freed them. When it comes to the losers of the conflict, American troops were not targeted, but their Kurdish allies were directly attacked by the Turkish Syrian National Army, and they let what they call a terrorist organization take control of yet another state. Russia's important coastal bases were not targeted by the rebel offensives, making me wonder if there was some sort of backroom deal made to either let them stay or leave at their own pace, but they lost a legitimate government that gave them permission to be there. Iran was the biggest loser in this conflict. Their embassy was looted, their bases were attacked, and their transit hub to fund Hezbollah and Hamas against Israel was gone in just 2 weeks. When it comes to the winners of this conflict, well, it's up to you to decide who that is.